where we do it. This is our 16th symposium, you know, so we have it on board. And for those of you who tell you a little bit about the award, we pride ourselves at the Phoenix Center of not being your typical think tank. We try very hard to do work that's serious and thoughtful and rigorous. And we find that happens all too infrequently, unfortunately, in the telecom debate. And I think, unfortunately, it's gotten a lot worse over the last couple of years. And so the person who sort of inspired us back when we were young whippersnappers, George and I, back at the FCC, was this man right here, Dr. Jerry Duvall. Jerry was the economic advisor to Ann Jones, was instrumental in writing Computer 2 and Open Skies and Competitive Carrier, and I'm sure everybody in this room is going, what's that? But if you look at that, was instrumental in how telecom policy started originally. And back then, when you were talking about breaking up the Bell system, nobody else would think about that. And so I was very lucky. Jerry used to give me a ride home. I would give Jerry a ride home. And every day in the car for about 3 hours as we were stuck in traffic, I would get an unofficial master's degree in telecom policy. And that's where I learned the business. But Jerry, and you do the same for George, where he would scream at us. You personalize, you've done something. So he's taught us how to do our work with honor and integrity. And that's why we wanted to recognize every year at our symposium a person in public policy who embodies that spirit. And we can think of nobody more than our good friend Commissioner Ohlhausen from the Federal Trade Commission. Maureen, you can look up her resume. It is truly phenomenal. I know that she's conscientious. Her motto is regulatory humility, which is far needed here. In addition to that, I respect anybody who can, in addition to doing their job. Neil sent me her bio. She's published something like 10 law reviews while you've been at the commission.
Yes.
You're almost up to our level. That's scary because I do this for a living and you have a day job. And that is very important. So we wanted to salute Commissioner Ohlhausen, and she's been very kind. So we're going to have a quick discussion with her. But Maureen, on behalf of the Phoenix Center, we would like to present you with our Duvall Award. And again, our one criteria is that you display it prominently in your office. That's the only thing we ask. Because everybody's like, oh, you got an award from those guys. So have a seat. She was very kind enough to join us at our annual rooftop event. I think she had a good time. She did. And what was great about Maureen, and I always appreciate this about policymakers, usually they'll come and give a speech and leave. And the conversation was on the topic that night was surprisingly privacy. And there was Maureen staying to the end and the sunset, and all of a sudden one of the panelists said something, and all of a sudden you see this hand shit up from the audience. And it was Maureen, and it was like, no, and I was like, this is awesome. So we appreciate that very, very much, and salute. So we have limited time, but I want to have a conversation with you because there's so much on the FTC's plate. Obviously, we have a new administration, but politics change, economic fundamentals do not, the law does not, and we've got a lot of interesting habits. So the first thing I'd like to ask you, and this is something that George and I talk about all the time. You run an agency which has dual responsibilities. You got the antitrust, and we'll get to the FTC stuff in a minute. But how should we be thinking about antitrust in the modern age? I mean, you've got, particularly in the Internet of Things. I say that for Dan Caffrey, looking right at the camera, so he knows this. Where Dan's in Brussels right now, but we got our Dan Caffrey shout out. But you've got the core, which is high fixed, which is going to be few. You've got the edge, which just has high fixed at some cost, but it's technology, so it's going to be here today and gone tomorrow. We have elements of vertical integration. Can traditional antitrust tools like the merger guidelines, George always has a line, the antitrust division can't count more than 4. How do we think about antitrust in today's environment? What do we do about that? I don't know if you had some thoughts.
Sure, and thank you, Larry, and thank you to the Phoenix Center for the award. I'm very honored. So just speaking for myself, of course, not the whole Federal Trade Commission, I think antitrust principles continue to play the fundamental, and should play the fundamental role in our approach to all industries, and that includes Internet industries. we need to pay close attention to the kinds of concerns that antitrust is meant to address. Things like, what are the dynamic efficiencies, rather than just looking at static, counting noses and saying, are there 10 players in this market, therefore it is competitive, and totally ignoring things like efficiencies and how we might now have competition for a market rather than competition within a market.
Absolutely.
And I think antitrust is flexible enough to account for that dynamism. I also think that sometimes people undervalue what antitrust can do and what it can protect. So maybe I'm jumping ahead and anticipating a question, but I sometimes hear this concern raised that, well, antitrust just protects economic values. So, but what about the First Amendment? What about diversity of content, things like that? And I think in some ways it's a little bit of a misunderstanding of how markets work and how antitrust work. Competition should protect what consumers value, because if there's something that consumers value, you should have a competitor out there who's willing to provide it, right? So I always found the claim that somehow competitors would fail to provide content that consumers want, or services that consumers want, or speed, or what have you that consumers want, a little bit puzzling, because I think, well, those competitors should be driven by the profit motive, and so they should be offering those things. So I actually have a law review article, another one, coming out calling taking competition seriously in broadband, where I explore these things more fully.
Okay, so we've got antitrust, and then we also have the unique body of law, which is the Federal Trade Commission Act. And the primary statute, for those who don't know, is Section 5, which there's a lot of talk about that. And so there's the two bits of Section 5. There's the unfair and deceptive trade practices, and something I want to bring up with you, there's also the unfair methods of competition, the UMC standard. Now, there's a lot of guidance on deceptive practices standards, not a lot, and I know that there was a very big thing about we need guidance. And I guess it was last year, the FTC finally issued guidance in about 4 bullets. And that was the extent of the guidance. And you wrote a very scathing dissent, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate about that, and do we think that would be revisited in the next couple of years?
Well, I think that policy statement continued an important conversation on this topic, which is, to the extent the FTC has power that exceeds the Sherman Act, right? Because that's what we generally enforce the Sherman Act. We do it through the FTC Act. To the extent, because we have this additional authority under Section 5, what does that mean? And I do give my colleagues a lot of credit for trying to give additional guidance on that. One of my concerns, which I expressed in that in my dissent, and I've said in other things, is we also need to keep in mind the process by which the antitrust laws are enforced in the U.S. So we have 2 agencies, with the FTC and the Department of Justice. And I was concerned, one of my concerns, was that I don't want to see the liability for activity in the economy turn on whether your conduct or your merger goes to the FTC or to the DOJ. I think that causes a problematic state of affairs and a lack of certainty for companies. So, for example, there was legislation called the Smarter Act, and that was considered in the House and the Senate, and the idea for that was to say that to stop a merger, an unconsummated merger, the FTC and the DOJ should be held to the same standard in federal court for getting a preliminary injunction. And I supported that because I think the divergence between the FTC and the DOJ's standard for liability should be minimized.
All right, and then my last question, and this is, I was reading this, what's come to the fore with the FCC's decision to reclassify was because Section 5 has the so-called common carrier exemption. And everybody thinks, oh my goodness, now that you're reclassified, and we've got the whole thing, privacy, we can talk about the FCC's privacy rules, but nobody has that big of a headache. Not much happening right now. But this is what's interesting. So, but you have this case, the FTC versus AT&T case, and I think once you read it, that's as big as the case as U.S. Telecom, because in that case, for people who have not read that case, I recommend you to do so. Prior to reclassification, the Federal Trade Commission brought a case against AT&T for allegedly throttling their unlimited data plans without sufficient notice.
Well, in contravention to a promise.
In contravention to a
right?
promise, yes, in contravention to a promise, so it was unfair subject, right? Without ruling on that, well, the legal question in that case was, and again, this is pre-reclassification, was for purposes of Section 5, are you considered a common carrier based on your status or your activity? And the court ruled, no, it's not your activity. I mean, I was always of the view, I might be a conglomerate company, so this activity is a common carriage, but that activity is not. And you obviously, the FTC had made the argument, well, you know, wireless broadband is Title I, I am not. The fact that AT&T provides Title II wireless voice is irrelevant to the thing. And the court said, no, for purposes of the Federal Trade Commission Act, it is status-based. So in other words, even if the FCC undoes its reclassification, under that case, you guys still, because it seemed to be like, well, if you're an old common carrier, you're an old common carrier, I don't know where you were bestowed this title. That means you will still have no jurisdiction over any phone company, any wireless company. Cable companies are different, because you never had it. But so you still, the case begs the argument, and we all, I mean, you know, the FCC's privacy rules can be heavily criticized. But their rationale was, well, we don't have jurisdiction. Under this case, even if you reclassify, the argument is, well, who's going to do it because protect consumer protection? Because you've got this status-based determination. That's a very broad decision.
Yeah, it is a broad decision. Of course, it is only one Court of Appeals, and we have asked for a hearing. But it does create this challenge. Now, the common carrier exemption has really become outdated over time, and the Commission has, on a unanimous bipartisan basis, for many years, recommended getting rid of it. The reason the common carrier exemption was included at the time the FTC Act was passed was because those were areas where they were already pervasively regulated by other parts of the government, right? So you had banking already pervasively regulated by another part of the government, railroads already pervasively regulated by another part of the government. It doesn't really make sense anymore in the telecommunications space because we've moved from a pervasively regulated monopoly provider, that going back to the Duvall days, to all sorts of cross-platform competition. And so the reasons for keeping the FTC out of the picture don't really make sense anymore. Certainly a challenge moving forward should the reclassification of broadband be revoked, addressed in some other way so it's no longer controlling. What's the next step? I would hope that Congress might consider at least repealing the common carrier exemption for the FTC on the consumer protection side of the House. Because on the antitrust side, while there is an impact on the FTC, the Department of Justice isn't so limited, right? So it's not where but the problem on the consumer protection side is you don't necessarily have somebody else ready to step into the space. So for example, the FCC can't, under its law, doesn't have the reach that the FTC had under Section 5. So you could have, say, just theoretically, a common carrier, because this has now been defined very broadly, who starts to sell dietary supplements, right? The FCC is not going to be in a position to go after them. The FTC would have been previously.
Right, but you read the case. Well, let me ask you this, just play devil's advocate. Then don't you, if you get rid of the common carrier exemption, run into the arguments, well, great, now I'm regulated twice, right? If you have a very proactive FCC. And then, I think most firms would say, I don't mind being regulated, but I only want to be regulated once. How do you get around it? Isn't it a two-step problem you have to solve?
I think, one of the things to think about is how does the rest of the economy function? So, for example, a pharmaceutical company could say, well, I'm regulated by the FDA to get my drugs approved, but then the FTC can regulate me for antitrust and can regulate my advertising or enforce, right? The FTC is an enforcement agency. And I think that's also an important difference between the FTC and the FCC. The FTC is an enforcement agency looking towards like very, actual harm for the most part, so we're not promulgating big agency-wide rules. So I think that, for almost any entity in the economy, there's more than one government agency that oversees them. Has the FTC been able to handle that fairly well? Previously, I think so. I don't hear a lot of complaints in the drug space. Previously, the FTC and the FCC had a memorandum of understanding of how we address things. So I think that one also should look at, you might say, oh, well, isn't it better to be just under one regulator? But also, what is the type of regulation that's being imposed on you? If it is a harms-based, case-by-case enforcement approach that the FTC brings, where we have, standards that we've developed over many, many years in this area, and the privacy space in particular, very much based on what consumer preferences are, I think companies should think carefully about whether that is a better regulatory structure, rather than one that maybe it's a single one, but it is a lot more restrictive.
Well, anyways, it is 12:35. I don't want to keep everybody too long. I know everybody's been here for a long day. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Commissioner Ohlhausen. Thank you all so much.